we will be reading from the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. The dates of the events and conversations are March 29, April 7 and 8, 1883. This is our online class number 54 on this holy book. Let us read from the book. I will start reading a chapter, a part of which we read last time. It was a part from Thursday, March 29, 1883. Sri Sri Thakur is saying, there are 3 or 4 varieties of renunciation. Afflicted with miseries at home, one may put on the ochre cloth of a monk, but that renunciation doesn't last long. Again, a man out of job puts on an ochre wearing cloth and goes off to Benares. After 3 months, he writes back home, I have a job here. I shall come home in a few days. Don't worry about me. Again, a man may have everything he wants. He lacks nothing. Yet he does not enjoy his possessions. He weeps for God alone. That is real renunciation. Last time I narrated the story of 4 mirrors. You may remember. We saw how a man was misled by his own image, which was reflected on 4 different mirrors. One mirror showed a distorted image of his, 2 others 2 differently hazy images, and the last one was a good mirror which showed him in his real feature. As I said, it is almost an echo of the truth revealed by the Katha Upanishad. The Upanishadic Mantra says, as one sees one's face in a mirror, so one sees one's own self or Atman in one's own intellect. That clearly. As one sees oneself in one's own dream, so one realizes the truth in Pitriloka, in the world of the Manas or our ancestors. Then as it is seen in water, so one realizes the truth in Gandharva Loka, that is in the world of the demigods called the Gandharvas. Then as it is in the case of shade and light, so blurred is the image of oneself in the world of Brahma, the Creator. Unquote. As you have noticed, the Upanishad has said, as one sees one's own face clearly in a mirror, so one realizes the truth, Atmani, in one's own intellect. Your intellect makes you stand in front of a perfectly clean or pure mirror called a pure intellect and make you see yourself as the most adorable of all such experiences. Because you experience yourself, not others who are outside. In the same way, the intensity and extent of our renunciation or dispassion should be different at different levels of our awareness. Because the thickness and quality of the covering on our self or the distortion of our idea about our own self or the impurity that is gathered on our intellect, that is different in different spheres or lokas. Hence, the intensity and extent of our effort to remove them will differ in different conditions. That is what is told by the Upanishad indirectly, like the differences in our images on the earth, in the world of our ancestors, in the world of the demigods, and in the abode of the Creator God called Brahma. When we know this truth, we too know that as our effort is, so shall be our realization. That means if we work less, our realization of God or of ourselves will be less clear. If we engage all our available energy to this one purpose, then our realization will be the clearest. Less clear means our conviction is mixed with doubts. That makes the image or the experience hazy, doubtful, distorted like that. That means sometimes we are most convinced and some other times we feel that we are not that much convinced. The clearest means there is no doubt at all, the clearest image. So let me make an explanatory comment on why Sri Sri Thakur said that there were 3 or 4 different types of vairagya or giving up of worldliness or maya. The Upanishad speaks of these 4 types of the hurdles in our different spheres or lokas. These ideas do not mean that all these are valid in the same Manusya Loka or our world. That may be our understanding. That is true. But the scriptures at other places mention about at least 3 types of vairagyas. Mridu vairagya means mild or weak dispassion. Madhya vairagya, medium type of dispassion, and Tivra vairagya, extensive and intensive dispassion. All these can be seen in people on the earth. Depending on the extent and intensity of our effort to remove the veils of ignorance from ourselves, our realization of ourselves differs. All are not cut out for the same type of vairagya or dispassion. That is the meaning. In the Gita, Sri Krishna mentions vairagya or dispassion as complementary to abhyasa or habit. Though he did not elaborate on this in that place, but the main message of the Gita is tyaga or dispassion, detachment or renunciation. That is what Sri Ramakrishna also has said. Now let me read from the Gospel for the next part. There I will not make any explanatory comments on the passage or discussions. They are so direct and so clear. They touch our heart because they have a direct reference to this heart. So we will read from the Gospel. Sri Ramakrishna to Amrita and Trailokya. Youngsters like Narendra and Rakhal are ever perfect. Every time they are born, they are devoted to God. An ordinary man acquires a little devotion after austerities and a hard struggle. But these boys have love of God from the very moment of their birth. They are like the natural image of Shiva, which springs forth from the earth and is not set up by human hands. The ever-perfect form a class by themselves. Not all birds have curved beaks. The ever-perfect are never attached to the world. There is the instance of Prahlada. Common people practice spiritual discipline and cultivate devotion to God, but they also become attached to the world and are caught in the clamor of lust and gold. They are like flies which sit on a flower or a sweetmeat and again light on filth as well. Let me read this paragraph once again. We will find the idea so familiar to us. Common people practice spiritual discipline and cultivate devotion to God, but they also become attached to the world and are caught in the clamor of lust and gold. They are like flies which sit on a flower or a sweetmeat and also light on dirty or descends on dirty things as well. So then we continue to read further. But the ever-perfect are like bees which sits only on flowers and sip the honey. The ever-perfect drink only the nectar of divine bliss. They are never inclined to worldly pleasures. The devotion of the ever-perfect is not like the ordinary devotion that one acquires as a result of strenuous spiritual discipline. Ritualistic devotion consists in repeating the name of God and performing worship in a prescribed manner. It is like crossing a rice field in a roundabout way along the ridges. Again, it is like reaching a nearby village by boat in a roundabout way along a winding river. One does not follow the injunctions of ceremonial worship when one develops raga bhakti, when one loves God as one's own. Then it is like crossing a rice field after the harvest. You don't have to walk along the bark. You can go straight across the field in any direction. When the country is flooded deep with water, one doesn't have to follow the winding river. Then the fields are deep under water. You can row your boat straight to the village. Without this intense attachment, this passionate love, one cannot realize God. So as I said, I will not make any comment on those things. They are very clear. But before I start reading the next conversation, I would alert the readers about the seriousness and care with which we should read and understand it. It is so moving and so comforting. We have to remember that it is Sri Ramakrishna, not an ordinary man, who is talking about his own experiences in Samadhi. There is a great risk that we, who do not possess a pure mind, would undermine his real stature. Anyway, we are so happy that some Blessed One asked this very important question, which is actually our question too. It is a devotee called Amrita who is asking this question. Sir, how do you feel in Samadhi? Sri Ramakrishna. You may have heard that the cockroach, by intently meditating on the Brahmara, is transformed into a bhramara, means bumblebee. Do you know how I feel then? I feel like a fish released from a pot into the water of the Ganga. Amrita, don't you feel at that time even a trace of ego? Sri Ramakrishna, yes, generally a little of it remains. However hard you may rub a grain of gold against a grindstone, still a bit of it always remains. Or again, take the case of a big fire. The ego is like one of its sparks. In Samadhi, I lose outer consciousness completely. But God generally keeps a little trace of ego in me for the enjoyment of divine communion. Enjoyment is possible only when I and you remain. Again, sometimes God effaces even that trace of I. Then one experiences Jada Samadhi or Nirvikalpa Samadhi. That experience cannot be described. A salt doll went to measure the depth of the ocean, but before it had gone far into the water, it melted away. It became entirely one with the water of the ocean. Then who was to come back and tell the ocean's depth? About the existence of the ego in Samadhi, Sri Sri Thakur has said, a little of it remains. This information is of great importance to all the spiritual seekers. Sri Aurobindo says in his book, The Integral Yoga, Samadhi is the mechanism. Samadhi is the mechanism by which the direct experience of these higher states of awareness can most easily be accessed. Unquote. So, Samadhi is the doorway to share information about spiritual experiences there, if there is any there. Let me elaborate on something here so that we understand the conversation well. There is a story of a preacher. He was preaching to his enlightened audience his Sunday sermons. He was stressing the need to speak the truth always. Then there arose an old man from the audience and asked, "How many of your audience do you think, sir, have not spoken a lie in his or her life?" An instant argument broke out. Then it was settled that those who have never told a lie in life should go and stand at the foot of the cross. And lo and behold, the preacher instantly moved to the foot of the cross, while all others remained unmoved at their places. He stood near the cross alone. Then the old man smiled and said to the preacher, "My revered sir, you have told the most obvious lie in your life now." Generally, this is the case with all impractical teachers. They think that to be a teacher, they should be perfect, like God. That is a gross misunderstanding of any standard. Sri Sri Thakur himself has said several times, pure gold does not make any ornament. it is said of one of the thinkers that someone told that I have found 10 mistakes in your behavior. I think it was about Tolstoy or someone like that. Then he smiled and said, "Then you know very little of me." So therefore, it is so revealing to read the information by Sri Sri Thakur about the reality inside the state of Samadhi. Of course, blessed, as I said, is the questioner. But Sri Sri Thakur is not sharing this idea of the existence of a trace of ego in Samadhi as a defect in Samadhi or anything less than a full Samadhi experience. He is stressing the point that in the dualistic Samadhi, one is able to experience it in Samadhi itself as the enjoyer of Samadhi. That is a dual experience. In this Samadhi, there remain both God and the devotee. And that devotee is represented by this trace of ego, as Thakur has said. But what he has said, he said that God keeps a trace of ego there. God keeps. Let me narrate an incident from the life of Bhagavan Sri Ramana Maharshi. One day, a young, well-educated man came to Bhagavan Sri Ramana Maharshi, prostrated and sat down. Addressing Maharshi, he said, Sri Ramakrishna was able to elevate Vivekananda to the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi with just a touch. Can you do the same for me? Ramana Maharshi did not say anything. The young man waited with obvious impatience for Bhagavan's reply. After a few minutes of silence, Bhagavan looked at the youth and in a soft voice asked, "You are another Vivekananda, I presume?" The young man was taken aback. He was at a loss for words. Greatly embarrassed, he left the hall quietly. Bhagavan then told his audience, it is difficult to appreciate the need for self-analysis and self-criticism. The tendency is to think of oneself as perfect. Though this person was eager to see whether I had the power of a Sri Ramakrishna, he was not bothered whether he himself merited comparison with Vivekananda. That is because he assumed, Maharshi said, that he was perfect. Sri Ramakrishna bestowed that rare state upon Vivekananda alone because he was a person of rare spiritual merit. Once, about 25 years ago, I asked such a question to Swami Bhuteshanandaji Maharaj. He was the 12th president of the Ramakrishna order. He was a real scholar of the scriptures and a realized soul. I asked, Maharaj, can you tell me in concrete language what a realized soul feels within himself? He turned his face towards me and kept looking at me for some time. I started feeling uneasy. Then he said, uncaused bliss. My eyes became big. I asked, what is that? Then revered Maharaj smiled and said, don't you know it? Then continue with your search, he said. Instantly I knew it cannot be given like an object or a thing to any Tom, Dick and Harry. Hence one has to experience it by one's own self. So Sri Sri Thakur said here another incident that a salt doll went to measure the depth of the ocean. But before it had gone far into the ocean, it got melted. So it got melted entirely. It became one with the water of the ocean. Then who was there to come back and inform about the depth of the ocean? So this example is the exclusive property of Sri Sri Thakur. But there is a similar thought expressed in a mantra in the Kathopanishad. The mantra says, Yathodakam Shuddhe Shuddham Asiktam Tadrigeva Bhavati, etc., etc. So, Yama is addressing Nachiketa, saying, O Gautama, O Nachiketa, as pure water poured into pure water becomes verily the same, so also does the self of the man of knowledge becomes one with the universal self or Brahman. This mantra of the Upanishad revealed a wonderful truth about the unity or non-duality of Atman, the individual self, and Brahman, the universal self. Sri Sri Thakur took this example a step further. His example of the salt doll is so concrete. We do not need much imagination to understand its underlying truth. The truth is that the concrete relative reality is an illusion created by different limitations of the names, forms and objects. Sri Sri Thakur gave the example of the salt doll which wanted to explore or fathom the depth of an ocean. Each one of us is compared with a salt doll, according to non-dual Vedanta. Now this doll is going to measure the depth of the ocean. The factors in this fact are so real. Then Sri Sri Thakur says that as soon as the doll went into the ocean, it got melted. This is also a fact. So the truth revealed by the Upanishad and also by Sri Sri Thakur is that the ocean is the source of the salt doll. That is why it melted there. It regained its real nature, that is non-different from the ocean. It attained non-dual experience. This experience is the same for both the salt doll and the ocean because there is no two. What happened to the dullness of the doll? That is actually what got melted, disappeared. The dullness of the doll disappeared. Disappeared into what? That would be our question. And that is a very big philosophical question. And we answered or discussed this question and its answer in when we were studying the Mandukya Upanishad. In answer to this question, we may say, number one, it disappeared into the ocean itself. The dullness of the doll disappeared into the ocean itself. Or number two, maybe into nowhere. The dullness of the doll disappeared into nowhere. We say it disappeared into the ocean because in non-duality, the ocean-like truth is the only reality. There is no other way. So it has to disappear into it because it is the only reality there. And this is a positive version of the answer. Or in the negative version, we may say it disappeared into nowhere because there is nowhere there. There is nowhere or when or what in non-duality. No time, space and object limitation, when, where and what limitation, because the reality is infinite. As long as we want to experience the experience of Brahman as our own experience separately, we are not experiencing it in its real nature. That is why the Upanishads say, Yo nastad veda tad veda. The person who does not know it as a separate experience knows it in its real nature. So the experience of the ocean and of the salt doll should be one and the same. Renunciation can be understood either in its positive form or in its negative interpretation. For the worldly minded, renunciation is a negative word, and for the spiritual people it is a positive word. The practice of renunciation by not so extraordinarily talented people is somewhere in between these two. That is a mixture of both the positive and negative versions of renunciation. The proportions of both in the mixtures differ. Hence, it has different grades or types. That is what Sri Sri Thakur is trying to inform us about here. Now we move to the book. We will read. That is Saturday, April 7th, 1883. Sri Sri Thakur was visiting Balaram in Kolkata. With Narendra, Bhavanath, Rakhal, M and others, Balaram, at Sri Sri Thakur's advice, had invited some of the young devotees to lunch. Sri Ramakrishna often said to him, "Feed them now and then. That will confer on you the merit of feeding holy men." Sri Sri Thakur looked on his young disciples, yet untouched by lust and wealth, as veritable embodiments of God. A few days earlier, Sri Ramakrishna had been to Kesav's house with Narendra and Rakhal to see a performance of the play entitled Nava Vrindavan. Narendra had taken part in the performance, in which Kesav had played the role of Pavhari Baba. Narendra said to Sri Ramakrishna with a smile, referring to Bhavanath, "He has given up fish and betel leaf." Hindu religious aspirants often renounce these, since they are considered by some as detrimental to spiritual progress. Fish and betel leaf. Sri Ramakrishna, why so? What is the matter with fish and betel leaf? They aren't harmful. The renunciation of lust and greed is the true renunciation. Then Sri Ramakrishna asked, "Where is Rakhal?" A devotee. "He is asleep, sir." Sri Ramakrishna with a smile. Once a man went to a certain place to see a theatrical performance. Carrying a mat under his arm, hearing that it would be some time before the performance began, he spread the mat on the floor and fell asleep. When he woke up, it was all over. You know the story of the 10 virgins also speak of the same truth in the Bible. Then he returned home with the mat under his arm. So when he woke up, it was all over. Those who take spiritual life seriously know that wastage of time is an undertaking that harms the plan. In any enterprises, wastage of time is a really harmful thing. In our life, we think that we are going to stay here forever. That is why there is no serious thinking about planning the short life that we have. If I have to live the whole life, whatever length it might have, I have to plan it as a whole, from birth to death, nay, from womb to tomb. But we are busy with how to live the life as a young man or woman, as youth. Therefore, we have almost no planning for the retired life. That is why we suffer with the life called old age that is being extended with the blessings of modern medical science. Extension we have got or are getting continuously, but that extension is happening at the wrong end of the life. The whole of life is by itself precious. When you add meaning to it, each part of life becomes meaningful. Each part. And when you add spiritual meaning to it, then each and every moment of it is essential and precious. And to be sure, we do not want to misuse any precious thing. That is how life becomes meaningful and precious in all its parts, with all its ups and downs, its trials and tribulations, its happiness and miseries, and so on. We have to add spiritual meaning to it. It should be guided towards the spiritual goal. That is what is called adding spiritual meaning. So we proceed further. The Gospel reads, Ramdayal was very ill and lay in bed in another room. Sri Ramakrishna went there to inquire about him. About 4 o'clock in the afternoon, some members of the Brahmo Samaj arrived. Sri Ramakrishna began to converse with them. A Brahmo devotee is asking, Sir, have you read the Panchadashi? Sri Ramakrishna, at first one should hear books like that and indulge in reasoning, but later on cherish my precious mother Shyama tenderly within, O my mind. May you and I alone behold her, letting no one else intrude. One should hear the scriptures during the early stages of spiritual discipline. After attaining God, there is no lack of knowledge. Then the Divine Mother supplies it without fail. A child spells out every word as he writes, but later on he writes fluently. The goldsmith is up and doing while melting gold. As long as the gold hasn't melted, he works the bellows with one hand, moves the fan with the other, and blows through a pipe with his mouth. But the moment the gold melts and is poured into the mold, he is relieved of all anxiety. Mere reading of the scriptures is not enough. A person cannot understand the true significance of the scriptures if he is attached to the world. Though with intense delight I learnt many poems and dramas, I have forgotten them all, entrapped in Krishna's love. This is a translation of a song. Now Sri Ramakrishna is adding, Keshav enjoys the world and practices yoga as well. Living in the world, he directs his mind to God. A devotee described the convocation of Kolkata University, saying that the meeting looked like a forest of human heads. Sri Ramakrishna, the feeling of the divine is awakened in me when I see a great crowd of people. Had I seen that meeting, I would have been overwhelmed with spiritual fervor. Sri Sri Thakur says, one should hear the scriptures during the early stages of spiritual discipline. After attaining God, there is no lack of knowledge. Then the Divine Mother supplies it without fail. Some years ago, back in India, one of our novices approached a senior Swami and asked, Maharaj, Sri Sri Thakur has said that one needs to hear the scriptures in the early stages of spiritual life. How long is this spiritual life? How long is the spiritual life? The revered senior Swamiji replied, let me narrate a story. Maybe it is a funny story. Once a young man came to a monk's hermitage. He wanted to become a follower or a disciple of the monk. So this aspiring to be novice took an interview of the senior monk. Sir, what are the duties of the disciple or a novice under you? The Swami told, the novice has to do all daily chores like getting up early in the morning around 4 a.m., 4 o'clock, taking a bath in the river, thereafter going to the shrine for prayer and meditation, spending 2 hours there, then coming back and preparing breakfast for us, and so on and so forth. And then the novice candidate asked, what are the duties of the Guru? The Swami said, just to guide the novices, just in one sentence. Then the novice said, such an easy duty you have, sir. Then make me Guru first. After narrating the story, the Swami said, you are asking how long is the spiritual life? It is up to you, my dear. As long as you want it to be, it will be that long. This is also very easy because you have the choice. You have the choice. You would like to have your choice and it is up to you. Then Sri Sri Thakur said, after attaining God, there is no lack of knowledge. Our spiritual practices end with spiritual realization. But still this spiritual life continues. Our spiritual practices will end, but the spiritual life will continue. Because we are not dying immediately. If we do not die immediately after realization, then there is a different question. But if you have to live, then that spiritual life will continue. The scriptures are sure helps to us as long as we are practitioners. That is, we are going on with our spiritual practices. After realization, our conducts stand proof to the spiritual realizations and truths. Then we move on to the date, that is the next day, Sunday, April 8, 1883. It was Sunday morning. Sri Ramakrishna, looking like a boy, was seated in his room, and near him was another boy, his beloved disciple Rakhal. M entered and saluted Sri Ramakrishna. Ramlal also was in the room, and Kishori, Mani Mallik, and several other devotees gathered by and by. Manilal Mallik, a businessman, had recently been to Benares, where he owned a bungalow. Sri Ramakrishna, so you have been to Benares. Did you see any holy men there? Manilal. Yes, sir. I paid my respects to Trilinga Swami, Bhaskarananda and others. Sri Ramakrishna. Tell us something about them. Manilal. Trilinga Swami is living in the same temple where he lived before, on the Manikarnika Ghat, near the Beni Madhav minaret. People say he was formerly in a more exalted spiritual state. He could perform many miracles. Now he has lost much of that power. Sri Ramakrishna. He did not like this. That is the criticism of worldly people. Manilal. Trilinga Swami keeps a strict vow of silence. Unlike him, Bhaskarananda is friendly with all. Sri Ramakrishna. Did you have any conversation with Bhaskarananda? Manilal. Yes, sir. We had a long talk. Among other things, we discussed the problem of good and evil. He said to me, don't follow the path of evil. Give up sinful thoughts. That is how God wants us to act. Perform only those duties that are virtuous. Sri Ramakrishna. Yes, that is also a path meant for worldly minded people. But those whose spiritual consciousness has been awakened, who have realized that God alone is real and all else illusory, cherish a different ideal. They are aware that God alone is the doer and others are his instruments. Those whose spiritual consciousness has been awakened never make a false step. They do not have to reason in order to shun evil. They are so full of love of God that whatever action they undertake is good action. They are fully conscious that they are not the doers of their actions, but mere servants of God. They always feel, I am the machine and he is the operator. I do as he does through me. I speak as he speaks through me. I move as he moves me. Fully awakened souls are beyond virtue and vice. They realize that it is God who does everything. There was a monastery in a certain place. The monks residing there went out daily to beg their food. One day a monk, while out of his alms, saw a landlord beating a man mercilessly. The compassionate monk stepped in and asked the landlord to stop, but the landlord was filled with anger and turned his wrath against the innocent monk. He beat the monk till he fell unconscious on the ground. Someone reported the matter to the monastery. The monks ran to the spot and found their brother lying there. 4 or 5 of them carried him back and laid him on a bed. He was still unconscious. The other monks sat around him, sad at heart. Some were fanning him. Finally, someone suggested that he should be given a little milk to drink. When it was poured into his mouth, he regained consciousness. He opened his eyes and looked around. One of the monks said, "Let us see whether he is fully conscious and can recognize us." Shouting into his ear, he said, "Revered sir, who is giving you milk?" "Brother," replied the holy man in a low voice, "he who beat me is now giving me milk." But one does not attain such a state of mind, Sri Ramakrishna says. without the realization of God. Sri Sri Thakur asked Mani Mallik if he had any conversation with Bhaskarananda. Manilal informed that they had a long talk on spiritual matters. Bhaskarananda said to him, "Perform only those duties that are virtuous." Then Sri Sri Thakur said, "Yes, that is also a path meant for worldly minded people." Worldly minded people means those who are living in the world as good people. Their sense of morality and ethics is based on worldly standards. In the Hindu epic, the Ramayana, Vali or Bali, the brother of Sugriva, the king of Kishkinda, said to Rama, "We belong to a species of the monkeys. The rules of morality in our species are different from those among the humans. Even we know from our experiences in this world that the rules of morality, the concept of decency, etc., are different in different countries and cultures. The contrast we can make of it with the standards in the purely spiritual world. Sri Sri Thakur has said, but those whose spiritual consciousness has been awakened, who have realized that God alone is real and all else is illusory, cherish a different idea. They are aware that God alone is the doer and others are His instruments. This interpretation is valid for both the dualistic and non-dualistic situations or philosophies. Janaka of the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad fame was a king himself, and at the same time he was a realized soul. He said that he was not the doer, even though he had to perform his duties as a king. So the standards are different. When we have this world as the be-all and end-all of our life, then all our standards of morality, ethics, they are dependent on the conditions of this material world. But when you see that there is something, or know that there is something which transcends the scope of this material world, then the interpretation of ethics and morality would be based on those transcendental truths. And that is the connection between the other side of the world and this side of it. That is the connection. So, one set of rules about morality and ethics would lead us up to the end of this world or up to our death. But another set will continue to lead us until we are freed from the bondages of this world, birth and death. So therefore the rules are different. That is why Sri Sri Thakur has said that is meant for the worldly minded. I say goodbye to you for today, but before that I would end this class with Om. We'll chant Om together once. Om.